Thank you all for coming today to the commemoration for Arthur Curtis. Arthur was born on 6th of July 1888 in the small country village of Marnell down in Dorset. He was the son of James and Kate Curtis, one of two children that they had. James was a bricklayer and a brickmaker, and the family lived in Brickyard Cottage next to a brick kiln down a winding country lane. The cottage is still there today. They moved away from the area though when Arthur was still quite young, and they went up to Wiltshire to Fonthill Bishop. Unfortunately, when Arthur was about 10 years old, his father passed away. His mother took the family back to Marnell, and she remarried to a recently bereaved widower there, and they went on, their families merged together, and then they went on to have several more children. We don't have any photographs of Arthur, unfortunately. We do have a photo of Arthur's mother, her new husband, and the three children that they had together, so we might have some idea of what he looked like. When Arthur grew up, he came to Banstead to work as a cowman, looking after a herd of cows. In about 1910 or so, the owner of Court House on the corner of Court Road there, Basil Goad, who came from quite a notable Surrey, well-to-do Surrey family. He was a broker. His brother had the distribution contract for the furs of the Hudson Bay Company in Canada, and they were very wealthy and influential people, particularly over at Chipstead and towards the Betchworth area. But Basil came to Banstead a few years before 1910, and he bought Court House. He sold it in 1910 to Arthur Norris, who we commemorated much earlier this year. And Basil moved to Longcroft, where the doctor's surgery is now, which at that time was a 21-room mansion, which had fields, farm basically, and it had his own herd of cows. And Arthur came to tend to those cows. And he lived in the stables with the groom who looked after the family's horses and their carriage. He moved out of there a couple of years later, and he went to lodge in a coffee house, what became the Corner House Tea Rooms, which was on the corner of Park Road and the High Street by the War Memorial. And that's Banstead High Street in those days supported two tea rooms and coffee houses, and eventually went on to support three. There was a sort of growing attraction for day trippers and cyclists and walkers in the area. So there's quite a lot of custom as well as locals. There were two kinds of coffee houses in those days. There was like a tea room style coffee house, which is what was down the end of the High Street, where Arthur was lodging, which might have had nice tea gardens outside and those sorts of things. And there were coffee taverns as well. And those were really a feature of the temperance movement. People trying to persuade men to give up drinking, they buy up the local pub and they convert it into a coffee tavern. So it would still retain the flavour, the social flavour of the pub environment, but it would only be serving coffee and other soft drinks. Now, Arthur joined the army in January of 1915. He joined the Royal Fusiliers. He had quite the war. He was twice wounded. He fought in several major engagements. He first went out to France in June 1915 to join the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, with whom Banstead man Albert Kennard was serving at the time. They'd just lost hundreds of men at the Battle of Vimy Ridge when the Germans had attacked a really thick cloud of gas, and the men in those days only had, well, basically just flannels soaked in chemicals to protect them. And they were no use against a gas cloud that potent. And they suffered something like 550 casualties out of 800 men at the time. They were absolutely devastating. And Arthur was one of a large batch of reinforcements that travelled out there to reinforce them in the Ypres salient. They stayed in the salient for a while, several months, and then went down into France when the British Army attacked at Loos in September of 1915. The 3rd Royal Fusiliers were kept in reserve for the first 2 days of that battle, and they were called up on the 27th to the Hohenzollern Redoubt. Now, if we were playing World War I bingo, and your card says Hohenzollern Redoubt when you come to these services, you'll know that that one you get to tick lots of times. And he fought on the redoubt alongside Albert Kennard and Bert Bowler from Burheath, who we commemorated recently as well. And they fought in defence against the Germans. The redoubt had been captured on the first day of the battle, and then the British had been pushed back until they held just the trenches on the snout of that redoubt. It was like a very low rise. The maximum was about 20 foot high, It's about 300 metres long, but it's a really flat landscape, so it's a very important tactical feature. And it was the gateway to a huge mining dump, which is very high, which was one of the chief artillery observation points on the front. So it was very important strategically. Thousands of men lost their lives fighting over it. You wouldn't know that today if you went there, because it's an almost completely level field. It's virtually disappeared. Unfortunately, in recent years, the French landowner there had taken to using it as a landfill site, which is a shame because there are potentially hundreds of British and German bodies still buried under there, but I understand that has now at least temporarily been stopped. So they fought in defence against German attacks over a period of 3 days, during which Albert Kennard lost his life. And Arthur was wounded in that engagement, and he came home for a couple of months. He was sent back out to France again with the Royal Fusiliers, and this time he was posted to their 8th Battalion in February of 1916. Now, he would have been serving then alongside Berheath man Fred Billing and Basingstoke man Tom Gurney, both of whom we've commemorated already. They were again at the Hohenzollern Redoubt. There were 4 major actions that took place on the redoubt in 1915 and 16, and Arthur was at 2 of those. On the evening of the 2nd of March 1916, the British detonated 5 huge mines under trenches on the redoubt, and the Fusiliers left their trenches and they dashed across no man's land. Well, they tried to dash anyway, because the ground had all been churned up, it was very muddy, there'd been a lot of rain, and so it was a bit of a slog to go. The Fusilier battalion that Arthur was with were unfortunate, because the German defenders had had time to get up to their parapet. They weren't as badly dazed as they were a bit further along. And they shot down the assaulting party as it made its way across no man's land. And of the 50 men in that particular party, only 2 of them made it to the German trenches. Other men of the Fusiliers, perhaps including Arthur, dashed to garrison these huge craters that had been created by the explosions. They were designed to do that as ready-made fortifications, really. And so the men would go up, they'd rush around the rims of these craters, get inside them, or line the lips of these craters, and other men would bring up metal loopholes, sheets of iron with holes in the middle for the men to put their rifles through, and bring up sandbags to consolidate those positions. And this they did. It wasn't really ideal for them. They found them really very difficult features of defences to garrison. And in particular, they were death traps for artillery, because the Germans could just lob shells inside, and of course all the men trapped in that small area. I say small, 100 foot wide, 30 foot deep, but in that confined area, they would be very vulnerable to shelling. So in the end, we withdrew from those craters to just hold the lip that was nearest the British trenches, and the Germans moved in to hold the far lip. A few days after the Fusiliers were relieved on that redoubt, unfortunately we lost most of the territory we had gained on that day, and their sacrifices had been in vain. They spent a couple of months in that particular area of northern France, and then they went down to the Somme battlefield in July. They didn't take part in the first day of the Somme, but a few days afterwards they did go into action there. There were 4 fortified villages which were still holding out, that were preventing the British from advancing from the south of the battlefield towards the north. One of those villages was Ovieres. It had been attacked at least twice, on the first day and then again on the 3rd day, when one of our other local men, Cuthbert Buckle, lost his life. And on the 7th of July, the Fusiliers had a try. And they made their way out of their trenches and across no man's land into a hail of machine gun fire from the Germans. They'd been shelled while they were waiting to go over. They suffered extremely heavy casualties because of that, more casualties as they went across no man's land, and they were decimated as a fighting force by the time they reached the German line. They tried to fight their way through the village, and they got to about the 3rd of their 5 lines of objectives when they were pushed back to the front line. And they held out there. It took another 10 days for the village to completely fall, when it had been obliterated more than any other village on the front, and its garrison had been reduced to a mere 126 men. Tom Gurney, one of our Banstead men, was killed that day in that attack, and Arthur survived. He was resting with the battalion for a couple of weeks after that, and they went into action once more at the village of Pozières in early August. The Australians had done a magnificent job capturing the village of Pozières at a very, very high cost. or part of the village of Pozières at a very high cost, but the job wasn't complete, and so more attacks were needed. And the Fusiliers went up to help alongside the Australians, and they fought to capture Ration Trench. It was an old communications trench which had become the support line as the old German front line had been captured. And they took part in that engagement and captured that alongside the 9th Royal Fusiliers, and Arthur was wounded during that fighting, and again he returned home to recuperate. Must have been a more serious wound, and it was several months before he was able to return to action. He went back out to France once more with the Royal Fusiliers in March of 1917, and this time he joined the 2nd Royal Fusiliers. Now, we talked a lot about the Battle of Arras, and it was the Battle of Arras he was fighting in. And he came onto the battlefield when they came onto the battlefield after the capture of the village of Monchy le Preux, which was on this high spur between two rivers, the Scarpe on the left and the River Cojeul on the right. It was the highest point on that spur. Just in front of the village was another peak infantry hill, and across that hill there ran a trench called Hill Trench, over from the left, over the top, and then down to the right. Now that had been the blue line, the first objective line 100 years ago yesterday, when we commemorated Thomas Rich's and Edward Beadle. They'd gone to attack that line. On the left, where the line curved, the village sort of formed a salient, a triangle pointing out, and Thomas was sort of set back on the left, on the wing on the left-hand side. They had further to go than the battalions at the nose of that triangle, and they had a hard time of it. They were enfiladed by German machine gun fire from the far banks of the River Scarpe on the left, and Thomas was one of the men that was killed that day. They made it into the German line and then got pushed back out again. On the right-hand side, the British were trying to advance up the Cojeul valley, and they suffered the same fate. They were enfiladed by machine gun fire from the far bank of the Cojeul river. And at the tip of that triangle was Edward Beadle, we talked about yesterday, and his battalion. They were far enough away from those machine guns on either side so they could reach their objective. But without those supporting troops on either side of them, they couldn't push on to the final objective. So they'd made it to their first objective and stopped there. The Germans then counter-attacked, and they pushed part of, or some of those troops back. So where Edward Beadle was, the South Wales borderers stayed where they were. The troops to the right of them were pushed back to the old front line, and they lost the first line. And the Fusiliers' job 100 years ago today was to regain that ground that they briefly held 100 years ago yesterday. And they were to attack that blue line, Hill Trench. They set off, it was an evening attack, and they set off in the evening with very little artillery preparation, so it was almost a surprise attack, really. And they left their trenches heading east-southeast, just off to their right, down off the side of the hill, and they were heading towards a small copse which sat on a spur that led down to the river. The right-hand company got held up in front of the wood by a very heavy machine gun fire. And the left-hand company, as they advanced, they saw that their comrades were in trouble, so they altered their course to come around and flank the wood from the left, and they took up a line of positions on that. The centre company, seeing what the left company and the right company were doing, swerved around the left company, and then themselves became the left flank and took up a line of defensive positions to cover everybody else. The right-hand company was now free to act and deal with the wood. They could see the Germans were in the wood, so every man in the battalion and the Lewis guns opened fire on the wood, and then they all charged, and they drove the Germans through. They took a trench just on the other side of the wood and held that as a defensive position. The British, as I said, had been there the previous day, and when they got there they found boxes of small arms ammunition and Lewis gun drums and grenades. It was an unexpected bonus, and they would need to use every single one of those. They had to hold that trench against the Germans for the rest of the day. There were machine gunners, snipers active, as well as German troops massing in a wood in front of them, ready for a counter-attack. And by a couple of hours after the attack had started, they were running out of ammunition. The Lewis guns in particular were empty, and the men had to give up a few of their precious bullets from their rifles to refill those drums. And orders were given that they must only shoot if they knew that they definitely had a good target to shoot at. Reinforcements were called for, just 30 men arrived. Machine gun teams were sent up, however. But the German reinforcements were massing, as I said, and a counterattack was imminent. And when one of the company commanders did a head count, he realised he only had 32 of his men left. The position was untenable, and so at about 6:30 in the evening, they withdrew back to the British front line. And Arthur Curtis was one of their many casualties they suffered that day. He was 28 years old.